Greetings, environmentalist, and I want to take some time to connect the dots so when we get into this next section of endangered species, you'll have a reference point to understand why things are kind of complex with this law. So, we looked at a variety of situations, including the American bison, the whooping crane. We looked at the development of the Lacey Act, various different federal regulations that were passed out of necessity in order to protect the environment. So, as I've said from the first day of class, protecting the environment sometimes has two sides of the coin. What do we need in order to balance the needs for humans versus the environment? Hopefully, there's a common ground somewhere in the middle that can meet the needs of both. So, whenever there's a law passed in the environmental arena, I would say 99.999% of the time it's out of necessity. There may be a rare case where a law is passed that really isn't necessary, and usually those laws don't last very long. They get reversed, changed, amended. But I'd like to give you an example from our lives where this would be a reality. I'll give you a couple. One's environmental, one's not. Let's say you're driving and you're driving in a canyon area in Colorado. Mountains are everywhere and they're tall canyon walls, and there's signs on the side of the road that say, watch for falling rocks, with a cliff on one side and falling rocks coming down the other. Sometimes these signs are flashing. That would be an indicator that not only will this happen in the future, it already has happened in the past. So there was a legal need to put that sign there. Here's another example. Most every city in the United States has some kind of ordinance that's actually somewhat mandated by the federal and state governments to regulate for fats, oils, and greases in drains and pipes. So, fats, oils, and greases, where do they come from? Let's say you're making pancakes and you have excess oil and you put it down the drain, or you're frying a turkey for Thanksgiving, or whatever celebration you may have, and you end up with all this extra oil. Sometimes people dump it down drains, like storm drains, or they'll dump it down their own kitchen sink. So here's the deal: if you stop up on your side of the line, you're always responsible for fixing that. But let's say that oil and grease makes it into the city side of the line. You would be required to fix that as well and pay for their analysis to determine it was your fault. So they do that through a smoke test, and they send a camera down to see what is all down there and how well the smoke can get through. So now there are fats, oils, and greases requirements for proper disposal of fats, oils, and greases, simply because for a long stretch of time, cities really didn't have those ordinances or laws in place that would help prevent these types of situations from occurring. Cities spend millions of dollars of their taxpayer budgets dealing with fats, oils, and greases stoppage in wastewater lines and so forth, and stormwater lines. So, well, how does that relate to endangered species? These are examples of how laws came to be because of actions of people. Sometimes an endangered species has nothing to do with people, but most of the time there is an element of human influence. So where we left off last time was initially talking about the Endangered Species Act itself that was passed in 1973. And as I noted, when President Richard Nixon signed that law into effect, he did it in December of 1973. If you remember, CITES was the worldwide organization of countries that came to the table to try to find a way to protect species that were traded for commerce, market, whatever reason, so they wouldn't reach the brink of extinction. And in order to be a voting or ratifying member, you basically had to pass laws at the federal level, whatever your country was, that supported the missions and goals of CITES. So when Nixon passed the Endangered Species Act, that basically meant that there had to be several different regulatory agencies that would have the jurisdiction to carry out the mission of what the president had signed into law, known as the Endangered Species Act of 1973. There are two major primary regulatory authorities at the federal level. The first is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service handles all the on-land jurisdiction of animals and plants. So don't forget that lakes, ponds, rivers, those sorts of things also are included on our continent. However, the National Oceanic However, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, known as NOAA, has a subset organization, regulatory entity called the U.S. Marine Fisheries Service. So they handle all the stuff that deals with ocean critters that are within our jurisdiction, within our exclusive economic zone. So there's two major entities. If there's an animal that crosses over or a plant that crosses over in both realms of jurisdiction, then usually one will take the primary enforcement lead in that jurisdiction of regulatory authority. So it's important that you understand both of these entities have the ability to list species. So we're going to look at a handful of the sections of an Endangered Species Act, and I'm going to tell you any legislation is going to have sections. And usually the first section is one of the most important. I'm going to spare you that for this one because that's where all the definitions are. But I want to point out that when you're reading any legislation, especially in the environmental arena, you've got to know what the government perceives and has labeled and actually quantified as the definition of choice for a word. For, let's say, what would they call taking of an environmental species. We'll get to that in a little bit. But there's a regulatory definition in Section 1. So we're going to start with Section 4 because that's where we're going to go through in just a minute about all the listing criteria and critical habitat clause that's included with the Endangered Species Act. The second section we'll look at is Section 5. That deals with land acquisition, otherwise known as eminent domain. In other words, taking land either for critical habitat or habitat restoration for conservation of listed species. Section 6 deals with the cooperation of states. So if you're not aware, most states have an equivalent of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called, for example, in Texas, Texas Parks and Wildlife Service. They may also have state laws that mimic the federal Endangered Species Act that allows them to regulate endangered species within their state boundaries. So keep in mind, just because they're federal laws, the state doesn't have the right to enforce federal laws. They have to pass their own through their own system of government in order to regulate and have enforcement power. So Section 9 will be important because it's prohibited acts. Section 10 are the exceptions to the rule. So in other words, if you break a law in Section 9, there may be an exception to the rule that you can ask for an exemption or a permit. But if you don't have a permit or exemption from Section 10 and you do the violation in Section 9, you will end up in enforcement, which is Section 11. So I'll walk through each of these, and there's a couple of stories that will go with them. So Section 4 requires in the Endangered Species Act that listings of organisms, both flora and fauna, just to remember, flora refers to plants and fauna refers to animals. These listings are required to be based on the best available, most current scientific and commercial information that's available. It now prohibits the consideration of economic impacts in making species a listing determination. That used to be available. So I know at the state level, when I worked for TCEQ, economics was a big part of our rulemaking process. In other words, look at what a rule change would mean to business, like small business. But if there's a need to list an organism and it's going to cause some kind of economic distress, That's no longer the determining factor that we will or we will not list. So Section 4 has three components that are really important. It has a component for how we list. Number two, it also requires that there's some kind of plan in place that will help the organism recover. What good does it do to put any kind of plant or animal on the endangered species list if there's no way to get them off down the line? The third component in Section 4 is probably one of the most critical besides the listing criteria, and that is the critical habitat determinations. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, like right now. So here's the critical habitat clause. Critical habitat establishes a link between habitat protection and recovery goals of an organism. How does it do that? Basically, it identifies and protects any land, water, or air space that may be needed for an animal or a plant to recover. So keep in mind there's a listing process in Section 4 that we'll be looking at here shortly, but the end game result or our goal is to get that animal or plant to a point where it no longer needs protection. So critical habitat is very important to that process. Since habitat loss is the number one reason why organisms are put on the Endangered Species Act, Congress had to look at the Endangered Species Act and amend it in 1978 in order to make necessary changes, and again in 1982 to define what critical habitat determination meant and put a mandatory requirement for that to be included in the listing procedures and descriptions of all animals. So likely you had an extra credit assignment for test one, and you were looking at the opportunity or looking at some videos I might have put up there regarding specific animals, and some of this dealt with critical habitat. How do we deal with the people needs? For example, if you're looking at something like the Mexican wolf or a jaguar, in our areas of the United States, they're mostly in the Southwest. Well, ranchers are down that way, so ranchers have to comply, and their property may actually be deemed as critical habitat. So the goal is that we could get the government and the people to work together and put incentives in for things like ranchers to be able to have critical habitat on their property without it sending them to bankruptcy. Our goal is everybody wins. That's what we're wanting to have happen. Now, all federal agencies are prohibited from authorizing, funding, or carrying out any actions that could destroy or adversely modify critical habitats. Interestingly enough, this does not apply to private non-federal landowners, large-scale developments, logging and mining projects on private and state land. However, permits are required. Let me give you an example of what this might look like. Let's say that I-35 needs to be widened. As we know, it is happening in Texas right now. A very highly traveled area is just south of Austin, going towards San Marcos and down to San Antonio. Well, right through the San Marcos area, I-35 may have some challenges where the federal government says, we need to widen that road, we need to get eminent domain to do it. They can't eminent domain land that could be critical habitat unless there's some kind of permit in place that they've applied for, even if it's the federal government, to give back whatever they've taken. So critical habitat, in order to mess with it, you bottom line are going to have an exception in Section 10 of the ESA. Another thing that's required in the Section 4 is a recovery plan development. This is like a no-brainer. So I'd like you to think about this as like the application process of getting a credit card. Section 4 is all the application process. Basically, it's the application process of a plant or an animal that goes through public notice period for comments, and then it allows for those comments to be reviewed. So basically, it's the credit card company looking to see if you qualify. And with that, there may be a check for your financial standing, and I'll put that check as the habitat critical habitat process. And then if you have a payment plan that you need to have for whatever card you may have, that would be your recovery plan development or your remediation. So the recovery plan is put at the very beginning, not the end of the process. In other words, there needs to be a plan up front for these animals that identify 3 very specific things. Number 1, any site-specific actions that would need to be managed in order for the species to recover. So this has to be thought of ahead of time. In other words, you can't just come in and say halfway through the process after the animal's listed in 5 years go, oh, by the way, we need to do this. You don't get to change the rules in midstream. You come up with a plan from the beginning. With that, you also put some measurable criteria that will show success has been achieved. Because remember, the end game and goal is to get the animal to recover. The third thing is you've got to put a cost estimate. If you're going to spend federal dollars through the Endangered Species Act, you've got to put a money figure to it. The government wants to know how they're going to be spending their money. And that makes sense as well, because some of the recovery plans cost a lot of money for specific organisms. Others have very minimal impact economically. So that brings me into the other portion of Section 4. This is the listing procedures. This will seem overwhelming at first because you're going to be like, there's so many different categories. Well, there has to be, because if you go back to the mission statement of Section 4, it said that it needed to be based on the best scientific information available. So listing procedures have each designation that we'll go through in a minute has a separate set of criteria. And I'll mention that as we start going through to kind of help connect the dots. So here's what's going to happen. Proposals, notices, and decisions from FWS, which is the Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA, which we'll assume is the U.S. Marine Fisheries Service, are proposed in the Federal Register. If you have not had the joy and privilege of reading the Federal Register, do a Google search tonight and your insomnia will be cured, I assure you. So these people have to put in their listing procedures in terms of having to follow a set of protocols that give the people of the United States a chance to have their voice and opinion. So how is this started? Basically, somebody recommends that a plant or an animal needs to be listed. So let's say this bird right here is petitioned to be listed. There's 3 different ways that could happen. Way number 1, let's say a lobbying organization like the Audubon Society or the Sierra Club decides that they have enough scientific data from research done, let's say in tandem with universities or their own scientists, and they're going to submit in writing a request with that documentation of scientific data that says, hey, we think the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to look at our data, and we think that this organism needs to be listed in this category based on the criteria that it meets. All right, another way. Fish and Wildlife Service or Marine Fisheries Service, which is a subset of NOAA, can do their own research, which they're constantly doing regularly, and they find the need to list. They'll make a proposed listing based on their data and put it in the Federal Register. There's still one more way. Let's say that you're a citizen, a concerned citizen, and you've been monitoring this bird in your neighborhood, in your area, for months and months and months. And maybe there's a whole group of people that have been summoned to do this. And you've collected this data, or you just feel in your heart that this animal needs to be protected. So obviously, letters that come in with no data don't have as strong a merit as those that have the data with it. Regardless of which avenue is taken, whether it's an organization, an individual, or one of our 2 regulatory authorities for the Endangered Species Act, those regulatory entities have to review those requests, those petitions, and 90 days after receiving a request of a petition for listing, they have 2 options. The regulatory entity, such as Fish and Wildlife Service or Marine Fisheries Service, will determine if a listing is warranted based on data that they may have and data included with the petition. The second option is if the answer is that more data may need to be collected. Really, there's a third answer. We don't think so. Okay, that's going to happen a little bit later. If they say yes, they must initiate a status review of the data that's come in and go through the formal listing procedure. What does that look like? So the status review is based on a designated set of criteria that is in the Code of Federal Regulations known as CFR. Guaranteed test and quiz question. What is CFR? Code of Federal Regulations. So once that status review is done, they will publish a draft, the key word is draft, rule in the Federal Register. And the Federal Register is kind of like the advertisement stage of the finalized rule that will go into effect 60 days or however long it takes to get public comment. So initially, public comment lasts 60 days. That is a test question as well. Why is that 60-day window so important? So I'll use my sister as an example. As I mentioned before, she's an attorney for oil and gas for ExxonMobil. So let's say that my sister, since she's like the top dog for doing all the land contracts for this company, it would be very important that she and her people, the people that work underneath her, are paying attention. Because let's say that they are looking at drilling for oil in, let's say, New Orleans. And there is a new species or plant that's been put up for proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And let's say my sister took an extended holiday and the people underneath her weren't doing their job. She comes back and finds out that right where they're wanting to drill, while she's gone on her extended holiday, public comment period has come and gone. So that basically puts her company out of an interested party. All her company needed to do was put in a legal opinion with hopefully some kind of scientific background data that says this is why we think that this animal doesn't need to be listed or it doesn't qualify as critical habitat in the area we want to drill. So same thing would be on the flip side. Let's say there was an environmental agency who wanted to make sure that this animal or plant is protected in the New Orleans area. They would need to put their input there in that 60-day window of time as well. So bottom line is once the clock starts, that 60 days is in motion. At the conclusion of 60 days, it doesn't matter. That's all the comments that come in and all the comments from the public that the government will review. The government being Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, aka U.S. Marine Fisheries Service. So 60-day comment period is really important. All right, so what I mentioned earlier, for every level of listing that we're going to be learning about here shortly, there is a criteria that must be met. Now, it's going to blow your mind how much red tape is involved with this. Bottom line is, in order for a species to get even considered for the listing process, it must meet one or more of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 criteria you see here. While they may look vague to you, they're not, and here's why. Each listing status, and I'll take an example, critically endangered, has a specific set of guidelines for present or threatened destruction or modification of the species habitat or range. Endangered has a totally different set of criteria for present or threatened destruction or modification of the species habitat or range. Conservation dependent, completely different set. So as we go through all the listings, what I'm wanting you to realize is there isn't just an easy 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 criteria. It is actually multiple layers of criteria for each and every listing status. All right, so let's talk about this. Number 1 is the most frequently used of the bunch. It's present or threatened destruction or modification of the species habitat or range. What does that mean? Usually dealing with critical habitat, loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat. Most of the time, this is going to deal with human influence, not always, but most of the time. Number 2 is the overutilization of a species for commercial, scientific, recreational, or educational purposes. So what is commercial? That would be something like commercial fishing. What would scientific be? Let's say we're studying fish and we're doing fish shocking in a lake. If we shocked enough fish, we could run a population. Okay, that's where the scientific studies come in. Recreation, that would be like fishing or hunting. Educational would mean that in the name of education, we harm or do something to a species that would lead to their ultimate demise. So we overutilize. This actually happens in these categories. So overutilization is not off the radar screen of being unheard of. It's probably the second most commonly used criteria. Number 3, disease or predation of a species is imminent. Now, let me focus here and say predation is not really from humans. So that doesn't put in hunting. That would come under number 2, or poaching. Here's an example. There's a gorilla in Africa that the population is declining at an unprecedented rate because of disease, specifically a strain of Ebola. So you think about that, that's not from humans, but we need to protect these gorillas and try to protect their habitat and help them from disease. I'm going to come back to number 4, so give me a second with that. Here's number 5. Any other natural occurring factor or man-made factor that could affect the species' survival. This will rarely be used, but it's not a catch-all. So this is the most infrequently used besides number 4. The criteria for number 4 and 5 have to be very specific. The irony is on number 4, let's read it, and I'm going to put my regulatory hat on and kind of get a little laugh out of this one. The inadequate nature of regulatory mechanisms. So if you read it, inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms, that means the laws aren't working or there are no laws at all. Okay, that's what it means. So bottom line is the government doesn't have a way to protect the species at all, or they do and they're not doing their job. So obviously that's not going to be used very often because, quite frankly, our 2 governing agencies that deal with endangered species are in the business of doing a great job. They have a hard job and they do a really good job of this. All right, so let's say that we've got a petition and it's come out, and the petition leads to a species review, status review, and let's say the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service puts a proposed rule out there in public comment. Okay, so in public comment, that may say, okay, we need to have 1 of 3 things happen after the public comment period of 60 days is over. Within 1 year after that public comment period is over, here is what the outcome will happen. Number 1, most commonly a finalized published rule will get put in the Federal Register that lists all the biological criteria, that puts in anything about critical habitat, all that stuff. Okay, so that's the most common way. Number 2, they'll withdraw a rule based on information and data that came in from entities that submitted during the public comment period. This has actually happened with a prairie chicken that's fairly famous in the United States from the National Rifle Association. So there's various different entities that could provide good sound scientific data to say, hey, really this species there's not a merit, the population's in good enough shape, it's not ready to be listed. The third option, which often happens, is from where the government, meaning the regulatory authority, says, well, we've got this information, we've got some pretty sound data, others is conflicting, we need to do more research ourselves and determine if a listing is merited. If they use the number 3, they've got 6 months for more research to occur before they have to make their finalized decision. Now, once it's in the Federal Register as a proposed rule, so understand there's 2 times it goes in the Federal Register. Once as a proposed rule and once as a finalized rule, okay? So after the proposed rule passes, it becomes effective in 30 days. So 30 days from that final draft that goes into the Federal Register, it becomes law. After that, if you haven't been reading your Federal Register at night and you harm an endangered species, you could be cited for taking. But you're like, I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? Well, you can read the Federal Register or stay in tune with organizations that follow the Federal Register, such as lobbyist organizations, organizations that are environmentally based that are watching for this kind of thing on a regular basis. Where would you find the information that's finally listed? There are two places in the Code of Federal Regulations, one designated for fauna, one designated for flora. So when you think about the federal regulations, Code of Federal Regulations, if you see that 50 before CFR, that's the title. And all big laws are broken into titles, and then they're broken into subparts or in parts and so forth. So 50 CFR Part 17.11. And that's where you're going to find the fauna or the animals. In the plant arena or the flora division, you'll find plants outlined in Title 50 CFR Section 17.12. So all of those organisms are listed, but they're not going to be listed in a way that you're going to easily find them. That's why I'm going to ask you to know the listing criteria, meaning the listing categories. You've already learned the criteria. Let's learn the categories. So take a deep breath. We're going to be learning about 8 of these, and I expect that you'll know their abbreviation because that's necessary in order to read CFR. Also necessary to read the red list. If you remember, the IUCN is the version of the Worldwide Global Risk of Extinction Taxonomy List. They also use the same similar abbreviation. So instead of seeing a name like polar bear, you'll see its scientific name, and then you would see in parentheses or under the category what it's listed as, the letters. So extinct refers to an organism that has no possible way of reproducing or continuing to live in the wild. A woolly mammoth, a Columbian mammoth might be in that situation. Before you say, what if we clone them? These are animals who've already gone extinct, dinosaurs, but there's animals who are considered extinct in the wild, and these are those animals that can no longer reproduce in the wild. So if you look at the difference between extinct and their abbreviation and extinct in the wild, extinct is EX and extinct in the wild is EW. So when you think of extinct in the wild, it's hard to conceptualize that there are organisms that just can't reproduce satisfactorily to produce offspring that can continue the gene pool. Truthfully, in geologic past, that's typically how animals go extinct. The federal government may not put a huge amount of funds to back organisms that would fall under the criteria for extinct in the wild. It's not that they won't help them. I can think of a case where that occurred, where we had, just on the brink of extinction, the black-footed ferret was put into a captive breeding program, a species survival plan, and it successfully worked, and so now they're critically endangered. So occasionally an extinct in the wild animal can be helped, but typically the funds are put to other listing categories. One that receives quite a bit of help would be critically endangered. Notice that the abbreviation for critically endangered is CR, not CE. So when you're looking on the list at the Federal Register 17.11 or 17.12, remember it's Title 50, you would be looking for CR as any critically endangered animals. So look at the definition. This occurs when an organism faces an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the immediate future based on a set of criteria. When you have a critically endangered animal, the immediate future means there's an imminent need for help. So quite a bit of money will go here to help these animals. Look at how critically endangered CR varies from endangered, which is EN, not just E. So on quiz and test, if you put an E, there is no listing category as E, it's EN. This occurs when the organism is not critically endangered. In other words, it doesn't meet those criteria, but it's at a high risk for extinction in the wild in the near future based on a set of criteria. So again, the endangered category will get protection and funds from the Endangered Species Act. When you think of endangered species, there's really only three categories that receive substantial protection under the ESA: critically endangered, endangered, and then threatened. So threatened requires that a set of criteria be met that an organism has a high potential for risk of becoming endangered, not extinct, endangered in the near future. We hope that threatened animals, by our actions, will now even need to reach the endangered list. So quite a bit of efforts, funds, and resources are allocated to this area. Vulnerable gets some protection under the ESA. It's VN, not just V, but VN for vulnerable. This occurs when an organism is not endangered and it's not threatened, so it doesn't meet any of those criteria, but it faces a high risk of becoming endangered in the wild in the medium-term future. Vulnerable, we can make a difference. If we can get it while it's vulnerable and change its status before it ever can reach threatened, one of the true listed categories where it receives full protection, threatened, endangered, critically endangered, we've done a great job in fulfilling the mission statement of the Endangered Species Act. There, believe it or not, are still several more listing categories. If you look at the box to the right where you see conservation dependent, near threatened, and least concern, they're all part of a umbrella of lower risk, LR. LR are those organisms that have been evaluated. In other words, they've been looked at a list of criteria for the ESA, but they do not satisfy the criteria for one of the other listed categories, meaning critically endangered, endangered, threatened, and even vulnerable. So let's look at this, because lower risk typically means that they're not in trouble, but they may be in the future. So within that, there are three different subsets to lower risk. So if you can imagine just an umbrella with a tier coming down, each one of them has their own listing status. So conservation dependence, one that we spend a lot of resources on, because CD, or conservation dependent, is one that deals with the 5-year plan for a habitat restoration or conservation program, so they will never reach the vulnerable stage. Near threatened, NT, refers to organisms which do not qualify as conservation dependent but are close to getting to the vulnerable category. Least concern, an LC, are organisms which do not qualify at all for conservation dependent or near threatened. There's still two more to look at. There's a category called data deficient. That is DD, and these are when organisms are classified when there's inadequate scientific data to assess them against the criteria for one of the listing categories. So typically we find a new group of animals in an aloof place and we just haven't collected enough data. An example would be there's some species of bighorn sheep on some exotic islands that fit into this category. Once the data is collected, then we can put them into the appropriate criteria, but you have to meet the criteria for each one of these categories. And remember, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 options that you can choose from: the habitat loss, the overutilization, the disease predation, inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms, and then natural and other man-made causes. So each one of these listing categories has a set of criteria for 1 through number 5. Then there's the not evaluated, NE. Not evaluated means that an organism has not been evaluated against the criteria. Typically, it's because there's not a need to have done so. For example, domesticated dogs, domesticated cats, most domesticated livestock would fall in this category. So if that just didn't go, wow, there's so many listing categories and so much that goes into it, you can see that this is an infrastructure that's been well thought out. So the red list mimics after what the Endangered Species Act has done to try to make this a scientifically sound criteria and listing process. All right, let's look at Section 6. Section 6 is cooperation with states. So this means that a state entity like Texas, for example, will agree with the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to enter into some kind of cooperative effort agreement that establishes and maintains active and adequate state programs that are regulatory programs. So they're the state equivalents of the feds. Texas happens to be one of those that has a program for endangered and threatened species, and we also have a set of state laws that mimics the Endangered Species Act. This is a great place to take a break. We'll come back and continue on endangered species. See you back in a few. Bye.